So, this is how to make prints with gel plates. One thing that I like to use for this is oil-based Sharpies. They stick to the surface of the plates a lot more easily, and they allow me to draw relatively fine lines. Here I've got a variety of sizes from a big old chunky marker to little extra fine tips. And obviously, you're going to need a printing plate. Now, gel plates are made by all kinds of different companies, and I want you to keep in mind you can get a lot of different shapes and a lot of different sizes as well. For the sake of this demo, I'm just going to be using some smaller plates though. You will also need some hard rubber rollers. I find that the hard ones are easier to clean acrylic paint off of, so I like to use those, at least for this process. You're also going to need some craft grade acrylic paint. You can use the fancy stuff, but you don't have to. I recommend solid colors. And also just get some metallics and glitters and things, because that's something you can use with this process. I like to have acrylic medium gel. This one is matte. You can also get glossy. This is Japanese unryu paper. It is a type of washi paper, and it's what I prefer to use for this. But any paper will do. You're also going to need something to clean up with. In my case, I like to use moist towelettes because I can have them on hand. Just make sure that they're still wet. I know that it might be a little bit difficult to find them right now, so honestly, just a wet towel will work. I also have a variety of different paint spreaders. This one's flat, comes in all kinds of trims and edges, and you can do some very cool things with that, although I will not be using those during this demo. I want you to keep in mind that this is a very multifaceted printing process, and a lot of people can come up with a lot of different methods for it. So this isn't so much the right way or the best way to do it. This is how I do it, and this is how I make work from it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of differently shaped plates. I like to work on a couple at a time because gel plates need to dry between steps. They work best if you let them dry entirely. If something's not dry, it can smear or it can peel up entirely and not transfer. And you can get some cool textures from that, but it's not what I'm going for this time. So I'm just going to take sort of a postcard size block and a circle, just a little circle. I've got bigger circles, but we'll go with this one. And a square. And unfortunately, this square one, I've kind of messed up the surface of one side because turns out you do have to be patient and not use a blow dryer on them. These plates are very sensitive to heat. And there's a larger circle and a couple of other different shapes you can get. And you can get them quite big, actually. Here's a much larger one, which takes a bit more time to work on. And different brands make them. Gel Plate Press is one, Jelly Plate is another, Speedball is another. You can usually find them in just any craft store. And that makes it very handy because that makes this type of printmaking very openly available. So I'm just going to go ahead and set up my plates on a piece of paper. I like to use white paper because first off, I can just use it as a palette right there. And second off, because it kind of holds the plates in place. The plates themselves are quite sticky. And you can see some ghost imaging from previous prints on there. Do not worry, this will not transfer over. They are faint enough that they're not visible. So I'm going to go ahead and take my oil-based Sharpie paint marker, and it is really important that these are oil-based. You can use water-based, but they don't stick to the surface as well. They tend to bead up which can get really annoying. And I'm just gonna draw out some things. All right, and so while that one kind of dries and sets up a little bit, I'm going to set it to the side. And this is why I like to work on multiples at a time, because since you have to let it dry between steps, you can use your time a little bit better if you're using more than one. So I am going to use an extra fine Sharpie for this one to get some very fine lines. And again, this is the oil-based. I always like to test the marker before I use it. And we're going to go fast again. I always find that sometimes it's really helpful to turn your surface or turn the thing on which you're drawing just to make sure that you have the best angle. Don't think that you can't turn your paper or your drawing. Little fine tool is going to be too small to fill in some big areas, so let's bring out the beast. So I'm going to set this aside to let it dry. Got to do a little bit of rearranging. Now, the plates themselves have a little bit of a mineral oil on them, so you can see it leaves a little bit of an oil spot on the paper. That's why I don't use nice paper for this. If you use nice paper for this, it's going to get some spots on it. Now, for this one, I think I'd like to play around a little bit and just do something a little bit more experimental. So, these are stencils. And these ones are a little bit fancier. They're usually meant for decorating cupcakes and cookies and things. But you can just as easily use them for this kind of project. So I think for this, I would like to go with one that has some stars and some bands on it. And the way you put it down, you just put it down and make sure that the whole thing adheres to the sticky surface of the gel plate. Just give it a quick rub over with your finger. Some bubbles are okay. We just don't want huge gaps. And I'm going to be using a metallic pen for this. Now, I don't have a plan for this piece. I'm just going to play around and experiment. Where with the other ones, I kind of had an idea of a sketch first. Just some things playing around in my mind. So we'll see how this one turns out. And if it doesn't turn out, that's fine. I'll recycle it into something else. So when I do this with the stencil, I try to make sure that you really, really work the pen tip into those areas so that you know that they're transferring. You can also do this with a brush. You can do this with alcohol markers. You can use alcohol ink. There's all kinds of ways that you can do this. But as I said, I'm experimenting, so I'm going to use the metallic copper. And once you've got everything down, just go ahead and peel it up. So I got a little bit of overflow in some areas. I'm going to go ahead and give this a clean off. Some markers come off with alcohol, some don't. So just try different solvents. It bled a little bit, so it's not the cleanest stencil, but it is quite metallic, and you can see the shimmery effect that it has if I move it back and forth in the light. So I'm going to set that up there so that can dry for a little bit, and I will get back to work on this one. I'm going to start filling in the colors of the eyes. I'm going to go ahead and use my copper marker for this again, just to make some really, really bright little spots. These will just really flash when the light hits them. Just some little touches. I'm going to go ahead and color in all of the pupils that have visible iris. Well, I'm going to fill in the irises that are visible with some red, and this just fits the overall idea of sort of the piece of work that I have in my head. Now, when I use this, I don't like to just go ahead and pull and scribble with the marker. You might notice that I'm kind of tapping it, because otherwise you can tear off sections of your black lines and have to redraw them. So it pays to be a little bit gentle. You got to be a little bit sensitive to them. So I'm going to set that over there, let that dry, and I'm going to go ahead and keep working on this one. Looks like a little spot came off. Too much handling when it's not yet dry will do that. So I'm just going to patch it up. And next, instead of paint, I'm going to use my alcohol markers. Now, Tombow makes these. They're similar to their dual tip brush pens, but these have alcohol ink in them instead of just water-based ink. Now, the alcohol ink will be transparent. It'll also pick up a little bit of the black lines, so you are going to have to go back and repair them a little bit. But you can build up tonal value this way. I'm just going to use gray here, but if you use bright colors, they come out extremely saturated. And if that's your thing, that's something to play around with. Like any form of printmaking, there's a lot of developing that goes on, and you'll be going over areas multiple times. You'll be correcting issues and errors. I like to scribble around the tip of the ink so that you can clear it of anything it ran into. If you see me scribbling on the side, that's just because I'm trying to get the marker clean. Now the alcohol ink dries pretty much instantly, which is really fun and exciting, and you can layer different colors on top of each other. So now that I've put a gray in the face, I'm going to go ahead and start filling in some color elsewhere. Going to go ahead and go back in and clean up some of those lines that got damaged by the alcohol ink. Going to go ahead and add some fluorescent touches. Now this one, it's harder to get it to stick because it's acrylic based. So it doesn't really want to stick. It wants to move all over. So you just kind of got to be patient and let it dry and do its thing. Doesn't pick it up terribly well, but that is a fluorescent red, and in person it is very bright. So let's figure out what to do with this. I think I'm going to add some dark glitter, and it looks like the emulsion has separated from the glitter a little bit. You can see it's just kind of a clear pool there. So I'm just going to open the paint bottle and just sort of take the glitter out by hand. And that'll kind of allow me to get as much glitter in there as I want. So now, using the flat of my brush, I'm just gonna spread it around. Now that I have basic even coverage, I'm going to take one of those moist towelettes and just really pull everything off my brush. Now these brushes will get a real proper cleaning later, but because I'm going to keep using these, that's good for now. So it looks like I'm going to have to do a little bit of rearranging because that bigger plate is now quite wet and I don't really want to be touching it and moving it around. So we're just going to turn the paper and turn the plate with it. So we're going to add a darker red here. Always got to pump the tip, make sure that it's working the way I want it to. And because we're working from behind the image, it's a little bit like painting on glass. You do your lines first and then you build up on top of that. It doesn't matter how it looks from the back because you won't see the back. When we print it onto paper, the back will be adhered to the paper. So I'm going to go ahead and try the white marker, but it looks like it's going to do that pooling and beating up thing that some water-based markers are known to do on these surfaces. So I'm just going to use actual white paint. And we're just going to use a little bit. Don't put out too much because you only want to use as much as you need. And using a little tiny brush, which just going to double check, make sure it's clean, and point the tip so all of the bristles are nice and clean and stuck together. We're just going to fill in the backs of the eyes where the sclera, or the white part of the eye, is. And now it's okay if you cover stuff up. You can cap your black lines and sort of build up the whole area that way. Set that one to the side, let it dry. And since I have some white paint, I'm going to go ahead and start filling in the face on this print. So now that that is filled, I want to add a little bit of a special effect. So I'm going to use, well, first I'm going to go over and touch up some of these areas that need some more coverage. And then I'm going to use a really, really sparkly, holographic white glitter. So it's transparent. So anything I put behind it will shine through. And that's an effect that I want to use for later because I will be using color on her hair. But for the moment, I just want her hair to be really sparkly. Many types of printmaking will not allow you to work with things like fluorescence and sparkles. So when you're doing a monotype, which these are what are called a monotype, which is a print that you only get one single image off of. When you're doing monotypes, you can get a bit crazier and you can do some things that you wouldn't normally be able to do when making a print. Now, as I said, this is not the only way to do things. This is just how I do them. And there's other tools and techniques I use to experiment and to play as well. This is just one that I think is relatively easy for people to try. go ahead and fill in this background with a transparent magenta, because I think I'm going to put a metallic over top of it, and that color will shine through and color it a little bit like just a really interesting metallic effect. You can always pick these up and check the back so you have some idea of how your print is going to be going. So I'm just going to go ahead and rearrange and finish a little bit more on this plate. Now, the bigger plate is still drying. Put an awful lot of acrylic on there, so it's taking a long time. And unfortunately, if you're not a very patient person, that's one of the downsides of this process. Everything has to dry between stages. Now I'm just going to finish capping the eyes with white, just so that they come off in one solid piece now that everything on them has had a chance to dry. And this will also make the white a little bit more opaque for when I put my next color on. Copper. Back over with the white just to make sure that that's very opaque. Take out some of those thin areas and brush strokes. And now I'm going to use a fluorescent red behind her hair with that glitter and with the tonal variation that I made with the markers. Gonna add some white first though, so that it stays a highlight. I'm applying it quite thickly here because I know that I'm going to give it time to dry. And it's a fairly transparent color. So I want it to dry with a little bit more strength and tone. So I'm just going to go ahead and test that. It's still pretty wet. So I think I might have to change my plans about what I'm going to do with it. But that's okay. That's why we have experiments. That's why we play around. Playing around is just a really big part of art. It's important that you give yourself room and space to just experiment, even if it means messing up. So that's still quite wet. But you can see the metallic lines over top of the glitter. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use some of the excess paint that I used on the other plates just to make sure I'm not wasting anything. Since this is an experiment anyway, there's no harm in it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a color shift layer, which is a color that changes when you see it in different lights. So this one is red, but if you look at it in the right light, it has tones of blue and purple. And that'll give this an interesting effect when you view it from a different angle. This is one of those places where you can really just play around with all of the special effects stuff you normally don't get to use. Just going to make sure that it's got an even coat and even coverage. Even this out just a little bit more. And while these are drying, I'm gonna go ahead and really just get a little bit crazier with it and just build this up into textural areas that I've drawn scrapes and lines in and moved around and just got really impasto. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the roller and I'm going to go over this surface just to make sure that everything is sort of evenly coated, and it's going to do a little bit more mixing than you want if you're not careful, but we'll see what happens. And now with this really wet coat of paint on the back, I'm going to go ahead and show you how I clean off a roller. These are really, really important that you clean them off right away. You don't want acrylic paint drying on your nice rollers. And if you have nice rollers that you use for other forms of printmaking, don't use those. Get one that you can use specifically for gel plates. So just going over and checking and making sure that I've gotten everything. If something dries on there, it'll cause a lump. So I'm going to go ahead and move these to the side and show you how we actually print. So the back of the plate is now very, very wet with lots of acrylic. Basically, you got to move a little bit quickly because this is the one time you don't want the acrylic to dry. So we're going to go ahead and grab a sheet of our washi paper. I can tell the right side on this because the wrong side is a bit rough and the right side is really smooth. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it down and gently tap it down with my fingers. If you're too rough with this, what's going to happen is that you're going to have paint oozing out all over the sides and everywhere, and it's just not going to be, it's going to be no good. So you can pull the plate as soon as you put it down and get a good transfer, but if you don't let it dry onto the paper, you'll get much less of a complete transfer. So I personally like to set it aside and let it dry in the meantime. So I'm also going to go ahead and do the same thing with the eyeball print because that one's quite dry. And instead of just a variety of glitters and sparkles and colors and things, I'm going to back this one with a very opaque red. I'm just going to go ahead and take my little spatula and daub some of that right on there. And I'm not doing the circular print right away because I put that neon on the hair down awfully thick, so it's still taking some time to dry. Remember what I warned you about, though. Don't go ahead and get impatient and use a blow dryer. That's the last thing you want. You can destroy your plates that way. So I'm going to go ahead and spread it with my roller. Once we get it all spread, we can go ahead and set it up for printing. And I like to set my paper up ahead of time. That way you're not getting paper while waiting, well, racing against the clock, essentially, because you don't want that layer to dry without you having transferred it first. I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to use a nice piece of washi and just gently tap the surface. Make sure that it's just really strongly stuck everywhere. You don't need a huge amount of pressure for this type of printing. And if you did use a lot of pressure, if you put these in a press or something, they would very likely crush your plates, which is not something that you want. So we're going to set that aside to dry as well. Watching paint dry is not interesting, so we're going to go ahead and skip to the end. I did my transfer with the circular one with gel medium, and I had an extra piece of paper, so I went ahead and made another print as well. Just because if I have a piece of paper, I might as well. So when I pull these prints, I like to peel them off gently from the edges just to make sure that everything is stuck down. Some people will peel them off in one go, and you can get some interesting textures that way. But I'm going to be a little bit more careful with it. We'll see what the results of my experiment were. Now, this still has some lines on it. These lines are direct enough that if I were to print the plate again, they would print again, just fainter. So that one's quite metallic. It's quite flashy. Not sure it's quite what I wanted, but it's fine. This one's stuck quite good on the edges. The edges are the most dangerous part of this. If the edges don't sit, your whole plate is basically going to pull your image up off the paper with it. And I've had some prints that have done that in a quite heartbreaking fashion. So now that I've got the edges loosened, I'm going to go ahead and peel it slowly. If you use thicker paper, sometimes it can take longer to dry and get to this stage. So you just gotta be patient. You can see how the clear, transparent alcohol ink sits over top of the other paints. So I'm going to go ahead and peel this one from the edges as well. And we'll see if it comes. And there we go. Now it did peel up a couple little spots in the hair. I don't really mind though, because it does give it a nice texture. And now to peel the surprise print that I made with the extra piece of paper. This one was much faster, but I do like how it looks. So we'll see how it looks when I peel it. All right, and I think that we are loose. So here we go. I decided to put some metallics and use a really, really matte black background. So there we have it. Those are the results of my demo today. Thank you for watching. I'm just gonna, those textural spots really don't bug me all that much. The edges can be a little bit rough, so I like to go over them. And as you can see, this was another experiment with pulling plates when they were still wet. They pulled off in a lot of really interesting textures and ripped off sections, and you can get a really grungy effect that way. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you do well.